Hey everyone, my name's Joe Adamski, and this is my presentation for EDU 503. The presentation is titled The Implications of Modern Teaching. Here's my table of contents. The things that we'll be talking about today are teaching in a globalized education system, teaching in urban environments or teacher shortages, teaching in diverse and inclusive settings, the implications of standardized testing, equity of educational opportunities, social and economic goals of schooling, and the implications of the pandemic on the goals of schools. So first and foremost, what were the original goals of education? Because in the last several hundred years, education has gone over a multitude of changes. Originally, according to Joel Spring, education was meant to more so teach morals that aligned with moral goals that were prescribed by the powers that be, whether that's the government or the religious institutions, things of that nature. Presently, we teach students to now compete in a global market. So, what are some of the ways that we work towards meeting those goals? Well, anybody will tell you that our political leaders are more so concerned with competing with our political rivals, such as China or Russia, and usually the way that they go about gauging that competition is through the use of high-stakes testing and standardized testing, and meeting learning goals through standardized means. Now, as I said, we'll talk more about the other types of goals of schooling, and that is the social and economic goals. According to Joel Spring, in his 2024 book, American Education, 21st edition, he cites that the original social goal of public schooling included moral instruction as a means of reducing crime. Now, that's based off of Horace Mann's intention that education would lessen crime rates, and categorically speaking, that expectation ultimately became discovered to be false due to a lack of correlation, meaning causation. In theory, that would make sense where you have more highly educated citizens in your communities, therefore making opportunities more readily available to individuals in the community to better their lives. However, the reality, unfortunately, does not match the goal that Horace Mann had originally intended to meet with education. That leads us to a good segue, the economic goals of schooling. Now, according to Joel Spring in the same text, politicians and policy leaders claim that educating students for work in the global economy will result in economic growth and help the United States to compete in said global economy. So what does all of that mean? In what I've taken away from everything that I've learned about the economic goals of schooling, it has a lot to do with how well we're preparing our students to participate in that global economy. What I've learned is that it's not just what the students are learning topic-wise and content-wise, it's the soft skills, as they've put it, the ability to pay attention, the ability to persevere when things get challenging. It's one of those things that I feel is critical when it comes to teaching our students, because if we're lacking in those soft skills, we will never truly be able to compete at the same level as our political rivals. And it's something that I feel that we should really start to double down on and start as early as possible. In my research, I learned that students who go to school in preschool develop those soft skills that I mentioned a whole lot more solidly than students who just start in kindergarten or first grade. And ultimately, those soft skills translate over to ultimate success in the future. Economically, financially, job success, overall satisfaction with life. Ultimately, that's what we really truly want for our students in the end. It's, are they happy? Are they healthy? Are they doing what makes them feel good. Now, teaching in urban environments or teacher shortage. Personally, I have some experience in both teaching in urban environments as well as teaching in a teacher shortage. And I figured I would give personal anecdotes to talk about this section. Now, currently I work in a urban setting, Allentown School District, and to be honest, a lot of the things that we contend with every day as teachers is large class sizes. In the beginning of the school year in late August, my class roster was sitting at 31 students. Now, because Allentown is one of those school districts that's highly transient, meaning students are coming in and leaving constantly, my student numbers have fluctuated significantly in the last several months. So, with that being stated, due to the high transiency of these students, their consistency of education is always out of balance, whether they're missing time due to that transition between schools, transition between homes, traveling to and from different countries, because the Allentown School District has a high Latino population, mainly from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. And many of these students are traveling back and forth, sometimes months at a time, where they're absent from school so long that they become disenrolled and then have to re-enroll once they return to their community. Other things that we contend with teaching in an urban environment is, in urban environments, typically the income levels are a lot lower than, say, a suburban school district. I've taught in suburban school districts very briefly. I taught in North Penn for 3 years and Lower Moreland Township School District for 3 years as well. And the environment from the funding is night and day. North Penn and Lower Moreland school districts have high property taxes that are able to help funnel into the schools to help provide extra resources for the students that are attending those schools. Whereas with Allentown, in an urban environment, because those property taxes are lower rates of income equity makes it a lot more challenging for the Allentown School District to provide resources consistently for their students. And in my own personal experience, in also working in the Philadelphia School District during my undergrad at Temple University, I saw a lot of the similar symptoms in Philly that I do see now currently in Allentown. Now, it's not to say that it's all doom and gloom. There's a lot of great things going for Allentown. There is a huge push for social equity and celebrating our cultural differences, and the superintendent of Allentown is working extra overtime to provide resources for their students to slowly but surely incrementally reduce those learning gaps by encouraging students to attend school more regularly, by requiring and asking teachers to keep track of daily attendance rates and then provide reinforcement positively to those students for attending school more often. She is working towards setting goals for higher scoring in the standardized testing in the PSSA, and also working towards adding more resources and opening new school buildings to meet those needs of the diverse learners that we have in the school district. And finally, another thing that she has done for the school district is continue to provide free and reduced lunch for 100% of the students, because well over 90% of the Allentown School District students qualify for free and reduced lunch. So as a way to blanket cover all of those students, it's provided free of charge to all students who attend school. Those students also receive free breakfast if they choose in every morning. It's delivered directly to the classroom for the teachers to distribute as needed. And finally, also, the school district is working towards providing one-to-one services with the access to devices. Not every school currently has one-to-one with Chromebooks and devices, however, my school does. Also, they provide hotspots, internet hotspots, so that students without access to the internet from home don't have to leave the home to work from settings other than the classroom, simply just because that is a result of the pandemic, which we'll talk more about. It just is one of those situations where, because it's recognized that there is such a severe need in the school district for all these extra resources, we're working towards providing those resources to help close those learning gaps. Now, talking more about my personal experiences in a teacher shortage, from my perspective, it feels not so much that there is a shortage of teachers. It almost feels like there's a shortage of supporting cast members to help those teachers. Those cast members would be your learning support and special education teachers, paraprofessionals and teachers' aides, specialists like librarians, music teachers, gym teachers, things of that nature. Now, I spent a majority of my teaching career so far working as a substitute teacher and instructional assistant. So the simple fact of the matter is, when I was working as a instructional assistant, sometimes there would be so many teachers that are absent throughout the day that I would get pulled from my regular duties and unable to assist and work with the students that I was responsible to work with every single day. And that lack of consistency has a severe effect on the child's ability to acquire new knowledge and learn effectively. Because the one thing that I have discovered in my time as a teacher is that consistency is what matters most. And this teacher shortage, or like I'm painting more of the supporting cast shortage, is significantly impactful to students' ability to learn, simply just because of the lack of consistency that it's posing to us. And I still see it happening now. I mean, our learning support teacher regularly gets pulled to cover classes because we only have one building sub, and she's currently working as a long-term substitute for our teacher. And I think it's mainly due to a lack of support. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily a lack of support from administration or a lack of support from parents or teachers or anything like that, but I just feel that in my own personal experience, a lot of teachers have voiced to me that they wish they had more support, and having that sense that we have all of the supporting cast members in place, that's really affecting us. And the best way that I can show that is through a video. So I'm going to show you a video from Fox titled "Teaching in the US versus the Rest of the World." Enjoy.
This is Anna. She just graduated from college in the United States. And this is Sophia. She also just graduated from college in Finland. Anna and Sophia both want to be middle school teachers, but it turns out there's a good chance their experiences will be very different. So different that Anna is twice as likely as Sophia to leave teaching for good. That's causing a problem. The supply of new certified teachers in the United States is shrinking, but the number of public school students keeps growing.
Massive teacher shortages.
Warnings about teacher turnover.
Educators call Colorado's teacher shortage a crisis.
So what makes Sophia stay and Anna leave? And how can the United States keep more of its teachers in the classroom? In the US, teachers work about 9.25 hours a day. That's an hour and a half longer than the average for teachers in other countries in the Organization for Economic Development, or OECD for short. That's a group of mostly wealthy countries that economists often compare to one another. Teachers in the US work more than 2.5 hours longer than their colleagues in South Korea, Finland, and Israel. There are some countries with similar teacher work hours to the United States, like New Zealand, Singapore, and the UK. Teachers in Japan, for example, work nearly 2 hours more per day than teachers in the US. But in all of these countries, teaching hours are much lower. Of the 9.25 hours that American teachers work every day, they spend about 5.5 of those hours actually teaching. That's more than the OECD average, and significantly more than teachers in New Zealand, the UK, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. Teachers in these countries get more time for planning, grading, and collaborating with each other. So, do all those extra teaching hours translate to better results? Students in the US score slightly above the OECD average on the PISA exam, which tests 15-year-olds all over the world in reading, science, and math. But they score lower than students in countries like Finland, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore, where teaching hours are much lower. If we look inside Anna and Sophia's classrooms in the US and Finland, we'd see Anna teaching an hour and a half more per day than Sophia. Anna also spends more time planning lessons, grading student work, and leading extracurricular activities. But those extra hours aren't necessarily reflected in Anna's paycheck. If you compare Sophia to other people in Finland with college degrees, she makes about 98 cents for every dollar that they make. That's on par with the pay ratio between teachers and college graduates in similar countries. But Anna and other American middle school teachers only make about 65 cents for every dollar that their college-educated peers make. Still, as politicians in the US never tire of pointing out, we spend
more per student than almost any country, I think.
Than nearly every other country in the developed world.
But that figure varies a lot by state. New York spends twice as much as California on each student. Mississippi spends less than half as much as Alaska. And American schools generally spend a lot more on security and other non-instructional costs than schools in other countries. Plus, if you look at the share of its national wealth, or GDP, that each country spends on education, you can see there are plenty of countries spending a bigger share than the US. There's one other difference between Anna and Sophia. When they're asked whether people in their country value teachers, 2 out of 3 Finnish teachers say yes, but just 1 in 3 American teachers agree. There are a lot of reasons why teachers like Anna leave the classroom, but if the US wants to keep more of them around, we might want to take a few pages from Finland's book.
So as you can see from the video, it is sort of bleak if you think about it, because everything that they're saying is correct in my own experience, where, we're being told we're spending so much more money than anyone else per student, but the data shows that that's not necessarily correct. And that's also reflected in the amount of hours that we work. Let's continue. With all of that being said, we as teachers are expected to teach in a diverse and inclusive setting. Now, to define what a diverse learner is, I found a really great definition from Breakout EDU, and they define a diverse learner as a student hailing from a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences. These may be related to their race or ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or regional or local cultural differences. It can even refer to a student's home life and or intellectual capabilities. Now, we as teachers, when we go to do our lesson plans, we always have to keep that diverse group of learners in mind to be more inclusive of those different learners. Every lesson that I plan always has to have my students in mind, because I have 7 students who are considered ELD, English Language Development students, and of those 7, 2 of them do not speak English fluently, and cannot read English fluently. And I actually do have students in my class who were once ELD students in previous grade levels, but have since moved on and moved out of the ELD program. Now, and that's just my classroom. In the other 5th grade classrooms, we also have students that have different learning needs. We have learning support classrooms, things of that nature. So when we go into our lesson planning, we have to keep all of these extra variables in mind. Being in an urban setting, I also have to keep in mind that my students might be coming from families of lower socioeconomic means, and that has a huge effect on their ability to learn and participate in the learning that's going on. Because although my school provides breakfast and lunch free of charge, some students might only be eating at school. And you'll never know that unless they tell you. It's something that must always be kept in mind when we are doing our lesson plans, because there's no one size fits all. There's no one American culture. Speaking of one size fits all, let's talk about standardized testing. I have an article that you can go ahead and click that link yourself if you'd like to investigate the article. But it is an article from Britannica, and it is a subdivision called Procon. And they list 4 conflicting pros and cons of standardized testing. Now, some of the positives that they talk about are the use of standardized testing makes everything uniform, it makes things easier on the teacher, it makes reading data so much easier. However, in my study of standardized testing and high-stakes testing, I've discovered that a lot of the so-called positives are completely and utterly outweighed by the negative implications of those high-stakes tests, particularly on the student, where students might not test well, they experience test anxiety, they might even just have slept on the wrong side of the bed, or they didn't have time to prepare for the test, and now they're expected to take what is essentially a test that either determines whether they're moving on to the next grade level, or if it's a test that will determine funding that their school will be receiving, or bonuses that their administrators will be receiving. It has a huge effect on putting that pressure on students to perform. Sometimes added pressure leads to diamonds, and sometimes added pressure causes a bridge to crumble. It's important to keep that in mind when you're talking about standardized testing and high-stakes testing, because for the teacher, of course, having a standardized test gives you a black and white representation of what your students know and are able to recall. But however, like we spoke about in the section about diverse and inclusive classrooms, there is no black and white. It's a mix of different abilities and backgrounds and world experiences. And so it's impossible to find a truly unbiased assessment. We are testing them in high stakes situations, and they might not have the social awareness or the cultural awareness or even the background knowledge to be able to approach these assessments. High stakes testing also negatively affects teachers. And even though standardized testing is something that is easy to grade and gets you quick data, it doesn't necessarily always look good on the teacher. If they are a teacher in a classroom that has students that do not test well. Now, for example, I will paraphrase a bit from the Procon article, where it was a principal who was looking over the data from a standardized test that a group of kindergarten teachers had taken with their students, and the superintendent had noticed that there was one class that completely outscored the other 3 kindergarten classrooms, and there was one particular kindergarten classroom that underperformed in comparison to the other 3. And the superintendent had recommended, why not have the teacher whose students outperformed work with the teacher whose students underperformed? And lo and behold, those 2 teachers were the same teacher. So to solely utilize standardized testing and high-stakes testing to judge teachers' effectiveness is disingenuous. Speaking from personal experience, when my students don't perform well, I take it personally. And I know many people have told me, Joe, it's not your fault that your students didn't do well. It's just a matter that the students weren't ready for the test, or the test wasn't ready for the students. And I get that. I get where that sentiment is coming from, because as a teacher, I can only control what happens in the classroom. I can only control the lessons that I'm delivering to the students and the lessons that I'm planning. I can't control if a student wakes up and didn't have dinner the night before. I can't control if a child's parents are going through a divorce. I can't control if a child is worried that their family is going to lose their home. All of these things are reflected in a student's standardized test score, and they're not necessarily reflective of what the student is able to do. Standardized testing has a lot of negative impacts on the school and the school district itself. If a school is underperforming due to outside factors such as low income, teacher shortage, or other things of that nature, scores are going to be lower. I'll be the first to tell you that, just like I was saying with my section about teachers and how these scores and these testing negatively impact teachers, it also doubly so impacts schools. Because if a school is underperforming, that could put the administrator's job in jeopardy. That could cause shifting around the school district, where teachers are moved from building to building or classroom to classroom. And all of that uncertainty is scary. It comes back to my point about consistency. When things are inconsistent the way they are, our students are the ones that are suffering the most. Let's talk about equity of educational opportunities. Now, to define equity, I found a quote from the Anne E. Casey Foundation, and they define equity as considering the specific needs or circumstances of a person or group and provides the types of resources needed to be successful. And that's exactly what equity is. It's getting what you need so that way you can meet the standards. The question is, are educational opportunities equitable? In theory, they should be. In reality, not so much, because of all of the aforementioned factors that go into the everyday life of your typical American student. Now let's talk about the implications of the pandemic. The elephant in the room is that education has never been the same since the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've seen it firsthand. I remember exactly where I was on March 12th when Governor Wolf came on TV and made the announcement that schools were closing in Pennsylvania, and we thought it was only going to be 2 weeks, and 2 weeks turned into months of school closures. And I remember it so well because it unironically was the day that the teacher that I was covering for in a long-term substitute position was coming back. She was shadowing me the entire day. She'd come back from an entire marking period's worth of recovering from double knee surgery, or double knee replacement surgery. And she was one of those teachers who hated to be outside of the classroom. And it was her last year. She was planning on retiring at the end of that year. And I remember the look on her face at the end of the day when we got the news that we would not be coming back to school. And the first thing she said was, "Wow, I'm upset. I spent months recovering to work towards getting back to seeing my students, and I see them for a day, and now I have to go back to working from home. I really felt for her in that moment. At that time, I didn't really have any idea how education was going to change, and I checked in with those teachers that I worked with in the coming months, and there wasn't much of a direction as to how to approach things because online teaching was not necessarily a consideration for a lot of schools. And over that summer, schools and school districts had to adapt significantly. So much so to the point where we were trying online-only platforms, hybrid platforms where kids would come in one day and then alternate and then come back in virtually on Google Meet or on Zoom. And it really took a toll not only on teachers, but I could tell it took a large toll on students. So much so that students whose only experiences of school were in the immediate post-pandemic schooling, where their kindergarten was taught over Zoom. And a lot of those students started to, what I noticed, start to not have those soft skills developed where they are able to sit, pay attention, and focus on the task at hand. I've noticed a lot lately that students these days, especially in my own classroom, learn very passively. They'll be sitting there in the classroom, they'll be listening to you, but their eyes will trail off to the distance, and it's concerning to me because that's not how things were before the pandemic. You know, sure, you had one or two kids that would daydream in the middle of your lesson, but now it seems that almost half the class is students that are disengaged. And it's not for a lack of trying, let me tell you. I'm an incredibly engaging and animated teacher when I'm in front of my students, and it's draining. It's really draining, and I almost feel like it's really hard sometimes. It's challenging to get up every day, put a smile on my face, and get ready to go because it's a lot harder than I remember it being. But then when I see my students in the morning and they say, "Hello, hi Mr. Adamski, we missed you," you know, that reminds me why I'm still here. That reminds me why I'm still going. Because, you know, for all of the negatives that we experience every day, at the end of the day, it's always been about the same thing. It's been about making those connections and building those relationships with those kids. And that's why we got into teaching in the first place. We certainly did not become teachers to make $1 million. And that's something that I can take with me. With that, this can be a moment for pause, for reflection. And I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear your experiences on any of the topics that were discussed today. Please feel free to send me an email. I'll read the email. I'll reply if you want me to reply. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on everything about what it's like to be a teacher in modern America. I also have a Google form as my interactive piece. So please take a moment to complete the Google form, share your experiences, and let me know. And here are all of my references that I utilized throughout the presentation. So I know that was a lot. I know there was a lot to listen to. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.